Wanted to remind you that there are other events that are coming up that we'll be hosting, and there is a flyer about these on your table. On October 30th, we have the biodiversity of the Nebraska within the Great Plains, and we're going to have Paul Johnsgaard, who's very well known, very well received here in Nebraska. He'll be here signing his book and giving a presentation on Tuesday evening, October 30th. And then on November 4th, our biggest event for families, it's a Sunday afternoon at Morrill Hall downtown. 1:30 to 4:30 is Nature Palooza. So please take these with you and share these with your friends and colleagues and family and so forth. We'd like to see many more people come out on October 30 to see Paul Johnsgaard. We will have live recovery raptors in the lobby for people to see as well, which would be kind of cool for families. And then, of course, on November 4th, many hands-on exhibits and activities for families all afternoon down at Morrill Hall. So again, thank you very much for being here, and pick up one of these flyers as you leave. Also on the tables in front of you, and I would really appreciate this, as outreach coordinator for the school, we're always trying to find out what do people like and what would they want to see in our outreach activities. So there's a very small questionnaire for you to fill out, and we would really appreciate it if you'd answer some of those questions and give us an idea of how you found out about this event, how you'd like to find out about future events, what other evenings might be better for you. Do you want daytime, on weekends, and so forth? So any information you can give us will help us as we develop our growing outreach program here in the School of Natural Resources. At this time, Mike Hayes, would you head on up over here? It is my distinct pleasure to introduce the director of the National Drought Mitigation Center, a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Michael Hayes. I'll turn over everything to you at this time and let it run. Remind you that we'll also do some questions and answers at the end. We're also taping this so that you can look at this later on if you'd like on our website, or have your friends who were unable to come here tonight be able to see this presentation as well. There isn't a topic more timely than drought. And as some of us have often said, drought is definitely not a dry subject. So with that, here is Mike.
And I think, Ken, I'll use this other.
I'll use this one.
Yeah, so can people hear me with this mic? Okay, great. Thanks, Ken, for that introduction. When Ken talked about this presentation, he asked to have a presentation that highlighted the National Drought Mitigation Center, but also focused on the drought that we're experiencing here in 2012. So there are going to be three of us from the National Drought Mitigation Center talking today. I'll start off with kind of an overview about the National Drought Mitigation Center. Mark Svoboda will then talk about the conditions that we're experiencing in 2012. And then Kelly Smith will wrap up with the discussion about one of the tools that we have here at the National Drought Mitigation Center. So that's how this evening will run, and we'll have questions at the end. The three of us really appreciate that you guys came out tonight. I know it's a nice evening out there, so we really appreciate having you guys here in attendance tonight. So with that, I think I'll get started, and I think I'll probably just use the computer. Go to the next slide. So I think this first slide of my presentation provides an important context for us to understand when we talk about the drought that we're experiencing here in the United States. This slide from the Food and Agricultural Organization with the United Nations shows two things. In the orange circles up there, that's the amount of food that's exported by those countries. And then the green circles is the amount of food that's imported by those countries. So you can see how that's distributed around the country. And you can see that it's not necessarily balanced. So some countries export more and other countries import more. When a drought used to occur around the world, it would have a very severe local effect, and that would affect food locally. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. Food is being transported around the world now, so that when we have droughts in one part of the world, it has a big impact on another part of the world. So when Russia had their drought in 2010, there were food riots in southern Africa that same year. So now, with the United States as a huge food exporter, experiencing the drought that we have now in 2012, we're really going to have to watch some of the potential impacts that might happen with food security around the rest of the world in some of those countries that import the food from the United States. The United States sends food to 160 countries around the world. It's a little early to tell what's going to happen yet, but it's something that we need to be watching as world citizens, what might develop in the next months and maybe a couple years. So as I start a lecture for a class, oftentimes I'll ask the question, what is drought? Because people have a hard time understanding right off the bat what is drought. They kind of know it when they see it, but it's hard to define. And so when I ask my students what is drought, I'll often show them this zebra. And they'll say, well, how does a zebra simulate drought? Well, if I were to ask you in the audience, if this zebra, is it black with white stripes, or is it white with black stripes? Half of you will say one answer, and the other half of you will say the other answer, and you'll both be right. Well, that's kind of what drought is. Drought is in the eyes of the beholder. It's how that person, how that city, how that state uses its water, and where does its water come from. That's really what drought is. And so it's important to realize that drought is different for different people and different locations. So what then I go on to say is that drought is a natural disaster. It's like the other natural disasters that we experience in this country, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, fires, blizzards, and so forth. This table is a collection from the National Climatic Data Center, NCDC, of the billion-dollar disasters we have had in the United States since 1980, so between 1980 and 2011. And you can see over that period of time, there have been 113 of those billion-dollar disasters. And you can see the distribution, or the number of those disasters, tornado events and hurricanes having the highest number, droughts up there with floods and fires and blizzards and so forth. But if you look at the damage amounts, you can see certainly hurricanes have the highest amount of damage, but droughts, $195 billion worth of damage in the drought events, those 16 drought events since 1980. So per event, 12.2, about the same amount as a hurricane event. So droughts definitely have a significant economic impact when they strike in the United States. And some of the earliest estimates that I've heard from this drought in 2012 from USDA is that their estimates are about $30 billion in terms of agricultural losses. $30 billion, so way above that $12.2 billion for this event. So this is going to be a significant economic impact event that we're experiencing in the United States right now. But droughts are different from those other natural hazards. Kind of picture in your mind those other hazards, and then picture drought, that zebra picture or whatever. Droughts are different in that they're a slow onset, creeping phenomenon. All those other disasters happen rapidly. They come in, they strike, they're very visible. Droughts are not like that. They're slow onset. Sometimes it's months or maybe even a year before you realize that you're experiencing a drought event. So that's very different from those other hazards. There's also an absence of a universal definition for drought. Hurricanes have a specific definition, tornadoes have a definition, even blizzards have a specific definition. Droughts do not. The severity of drought is best described through multiple indicators and indices. And some people argue that we should even define drought based on the impacts, because drought's going to be different for a dryland agricultural producer as it is for an irrigator, or for the city of Lincoln, or for the city of Phoenix. Droughts are going to be different. And they're also a relative condition. You can have droughts in Nebraska, but you can also have droughts in Phoenix, in Arizona, or you can have droughts in a very wet climate like Maine. So droughts have to be relative. And then the impacts from drought are non-structural and spread over large areas. If you think about those other hazards, they have structural damage to them. And the economic impacts are very easy to calculate with those other hazards. That's not true with drought. So all these characteristics of drought make them more challenging to deal with than some of those other natural hazards that we have in the U.S. But droughts are a normal part of climate in the US, and I think this graphic illustrates that. This is the percent of the United States in severe to extreme drought from 1895, here on the left part of the graph, up through August of 2012. And you can see that droughts are a regular feature of the climate in the United States, right? So droughts are occurring all throughout here. Mark, this isn't showing up that good, but you can see in August we're creeping up to about 40% of the nation in severe to extreme drought. That's about equal to what we saw in 2002, 2000, some of the other droughts. You see it's not quite on par with some of the past droughts, the 1950s drought, and then the 1930s drought, 1934, 64% of the US in severe to extreme drought, according to this one metric on tracking droughts. But it's a normal part of climate across the US. It's also a normal part of climate in Nebraska. So this is a graph that shows annual precipitation for the state, again going back to 1895 here on the left, up through 2011, so not 2012. And you can see that again, there's variability in Nebraska's precipitation. You can see some of the dryness down here. In fact, this highlights some of the famous droughts that we're familiar with here in Nebraska. This is the early 2000s drought. 1988 and 89 were big drought years here in Nebraska. The 70s drought. This is the 50s drought in Nebraska. And then, of course, the 1930s really stand out as a big drought period, right? What's interesting, if you look at the last couple years, though, look at this wetness that we've had from about 2007. So we've gone into this drought in 2012, following a period of relative wetness across the state. 5 years of almost unprecedented relatively wet conditions. You could go back maybe to the early 1900s and see a similar period, but a very wet period, and I think that's really helped us in dealing with this drought in 2012. This graphic is a similar one to the previous one, only it's for year-to-date precipitation up through August, so it includes 2012, and I'm just going to show that because if you look at 2012, it dips way down here to where this black arrow is covering the end on the slide, so way down here, just above the 1934 amount. So definitely 2012 in Nebraska is a year that puts it relatively similar to what we experienced in the 1930s. We also know that droughts in Nebraska can be multiple year events. This is a graphic that comes from work that Harold Weekly, who was a professor here at the University of Nebraska, did using tree rings in western Nebraska, out of Ash Hollow in western Nebraska. And so he analyzed tree rings, and with those trees he could go back and look at droughts from 1200 to 1960. And if you look at this timeline, 1200 here, 1960 on the lower right, the periods in red are those dry years, dry periods that are 5 years or more. So I think it's really interesting to highlight. Here's what the 1930s look like on this data set. So that's the 1930s, one of the droughts that we remember as being the classic drought in Nebraska. But it's certainly not a unique feature. In fact, you look back at some of these other periods of drought, in the late 1600s, 20 years, here in the 1500s, 26 years, here in the 1200s, 38 years. So definitely periods of multiple year droughts are not that unusual in Nebraska. Hopefully we won't be moving into such a period with this drought that we've started here in 2012. So the National Drought Mitigation Center, just a little background, came out of a conference that was held in Portland, Oregon in 1994. There was a drought that was going on in the western United States, and scientists from around the country got together in Portland, and one of the recommendations made from this conference in 1994 was that the United States needed a national center that focused on drought management strategies. And so taking that recommendation, Professor Don Wilhite here at the University of Nebraska took that recommendation and formed the National Drought Mitigation Center in 1995. So that's a little history about why the National Drought Mitigation Center was formed here at the University of Nebraska. The mission of our center is to reduce societal vulnerability to drought by promoting planning ahead for drought, and the adoption of appropriate risk management techniques. Now, that's a pretty hearty statement. So what I like to do is show this next graphic, which I think provides a visual representation of what our mission is. This graphic comes out of natural hazards literature. It's the cycle of disaster management, so this can be applied to any natural hazard. And this cycle is broken up into two parts. The bottom part in red is the crisis management part of the cycle. This is what you do after a disaster occurs in kind of responding or doing the recovery to the disaster. The top part of this cycle is the risk management part of the cycle in blue. And these are the activities you would do before a disaster occurs to hopefully reduce your risk to that disaster. So they include things like monitoring and prediction, planning, and then mitigation. Now, mitigation is one of those terms that has a lot of different meanings. So when we use the term mitigation for the National Drought Mitigation Center or up here in the cycle of disaster management, what we really mean are those activities that one can take before an event occurs that reduces your risk to that event. That's what we mean by mitigation. So really, this cycle works for a lot of things in our lives. For example, health. We apply the same cycle of disaster management for health. So before a health disaster might occur, we really need to be monitoring our health condition, right? We need to be planning ahead, having health insurance, life insurance, and we need to be taking mitigation strategies, running, exercises, those types of things. So that's a good way to apply kind of this cycle to a common day practice, but it works very good for drought. And the National Drought Mitigation Center, we emphasize activities in monitoring, planning, and drought mitigation strategies. So those are the activities that we do at the National Drought Mitigation Center. Now, drought is very complex, and we need diversity in people to deal with drought. And so some people will talk to us and they'll say, the National Drought Mitigation Center is just a bunch of climatologists that are working on drought. Well, that's not true. Certainly we have people within the physical sciences, climatology, meteorologists, remote sensing, water resources, but we also have personnel within the center who specialize in the social science and humanities, and also other professions, public participation, education, computer science, GIS, and so forth. We need that diversity of people responding to drought, working on drought at the center in order to address the complexity of drought-related issues in the U.S. So we have 16 people that work at the National Drought Mitigation Center right now. Because of the diversity and the complexity of drought, we also have a diversity in funding that we receive at the National Drought Mitigation Center and a diversity of projects that we do related to that funding. So one of the sources of funding for the National Drought Mitigation Center is USDA. And so one of the projects we work on is developing a tool for livestock producers around the country called Managing Drought Risk on the Ranch. They can go to this website or they can access a guide dealing with drought risk, and they can work on that guide. We've been holding workshops around the country during 2012 to introduce livestock producers to this activity that we have at the National Drought Mitigation Center. We also get quite a bit of funding from NOAA, our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So one of the projects that Kelly and Mark are heavily involved with is working with communities and the American Planning Association to help communities come up with a guide to make them better prepared for droughts in the future. That guide is called Drought Ready Communities, or that project called the Drought Ready Communities Project. That's one of the activities that we're involved with. We also get funding to help with the U.S. Drought Monitor map production and our drought impact reporter that Kelly's going to be talking about in a few minutes. There's also an organization, a federal program called the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS. We do a lot of activities and we get support from NIDIS to help provide support to NIDIS for some of their activities. This slide shows another activity we're involved in. It's a remote sensing derived product called the Vegetation Drought Response Index. It looks at vegetation conditions around the country. It's a project where now our funding is coming from NASA, but we got some initial funding from the U.S. Geological Survey, from USDA, and one of our partner centers here at the in the School of Natural Resources, the High Plains Regional Climate Center, is involved in this project. We also get some funding from EPA, and this illustrates some of our educational and outreach activities. There's a program now that we're working with the School of Natural Resources, the High Plains Climate Center, called Climate Masters. Some of you might be familiar with Master Gardener and that program. Well, this is a program kind of designed around that concept where people can become climate masters. They go through a course, a 10-week course, at becoming educated in climate-related issues, sustainability, yards, renewable issues. They go on field trips, and then they have to contribute 30 hours of volunteer service as part of the training to become a climate masters person. And so we are involved in this activity. And then finally, that kind of brings us to 2012. These are some of the images that we've experienced in 2012, not necessarily in Nebraska, of course. In fact, this picture in the upper left corner is the Waldo Canyon fire outside of Colorado Springs. The fires in Colorado really centered the media attention across the country on how serious this drought is as it was developing around the country. Here's what corn looked like in Missouri this year, corn in Illinois in that picture, soybeans in Arkansas, this is pasture in Oklahoma, and then a stream in northeast Nebraska. So these are some of the impacts that we saw in 2012. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Mark Svoboda. We're very lucky to have Mark here at the University of Nebraska. I would claim that Mark is the world's leading expert on monitoring drought. And we have him here at the University of Nebraska.
All right. Thank you, Mike, for that nice introduction. It's amazing what 20 bucks will still get a guy. But all right, so let's talk about what got us into this mess. I'm going to focus on sort of a little bit of the preceding conditions, the hangover from 2011, for example, that bled into 2012 as we saw this drought kind of encroach upon Nebraska and the Central Plains out of the Southern Plains drought of 2011. So we'll take a look at current conditions and we'll look back a little bit, talk about the impacts as we've seen them, which should be a good segue to Kelly's talk later on the impact reporter tool that we started up in 2005, and then maybe a look into the hazy crystal ball, not so crystalline. And we'll take questions at the end of Kelly's talk. So if we can just sort of set the stage and go back to earlier this year, I think this drought will go down on record as one of the prime classic cases of what we call a flash drought, sort of an intra-seasonal drought that develops in the time frame of weeks or a month or two, not months or years, that typically lead to a long drawdown of, say, water supply. But we saw some impacts come on us this year that you might not typically see until you see a 2-year drought. So it's been a very interesting case study. So the top left, spring of this year, Nebraska, you can see there, and I'll show a blow up of Nebraska in a little bit, pretty much in the clear, right? But we knew going into this year, for this whole region, particularly in the entire Midwest and say the whole Corn Belt, which extends from eastern Ohio to central Nebraska, we had a couple things going against us heading into this year. We had a relatively mild winter with very little snow in these areas that typically expect to see snow. In fact, that could be arguably the first impacts of the drought. We call that snow drought. There's a huge recreation tourism economies dependent on outdoor activities in these northern Great Lakes states that are based around the snow. Several were canceled. It affects hunting, it affects snowmobiling, it affects all of these things. So you really don't think about those aspects of drought. So we didn't have that soil moisture recharge. Then if you recall earlier this spring, we saw record temperatures in February and March across a good portion of this region. We did not get the spring rains we anticipated. And so we were 2 strikes against us heading into summer. And when you head into summer in the Midwest, when you rely on hit or miss thunderstorms, that's not a good thing because it's very convective in nature, it's very spotty. You don't see widespread rains that bring widespread relief. So as we progress to May, same situation in Nebraska in the Corn Belt. Not much of a story there to tell. But I recall vividly when the drought started in my mind was June 27th. We were out of town doing a workshop. Kelly was actually with me. And the phone just started ringing off the hook. That was the first part of that middle long duration heat wave we saw in June that went away for a little bit, a little after the 4th of July, but came back with a vengeance again later on in July. And you can see now all of a sudden Nebraska is into severe drought in the western part of the state. And now we see the entire state's basically painted red with exceptional type of drought. And we'll show you that in a little bit more detail. So this just blows up where we are as of the map of last week. This map's updated weekly with our partners at USDA and NOAA. And it's not hard to see the spatial footprint. As Mike alluded to, droughts have these major impacts because they cover such a large area. We don't see them coming on satellite. We don't see them coming on radar like you do tornadoes or flash floods. So it's a much more difficult beast to monitor, and you have to be diligent in doing it. And this product is one way to keep our eye on emerging situations on a weekly basis. And even this one was difficult for us because of the temperature component, which I'll get into just a little bit later here. So on the bottom there, I have 2 red circles. The first column is any classification of drought. We see 65% of the lower 48 states in drought. This is the most drought we've seen since the 50s drought and the 30s drought. So by far, in the last 110 years or so, this is in one of the top 3 droughts as far as spatial coverage. Not necessarily in all other aspects. Keep in mind, as Mike showed, this was just sort of a blip here because we're in the first year of this drought in this region. People ask you, can it get worse? And the answer, unfortunately, is yes. It gets worse when it goes for years instead of months. So we hope that doesn't happen, but the story still needs to be told. It's hard to put it into proper historical perspective until the drought's over, and it's not over. Of also significant here is this 21.5% nearly in the 2 worst drought categories for the lower 48. That's 5% more than that average you would see that Mike showed the one graphic of the time series early in the 2 worst categories, not just severe, but also in extreme and exceptional. So that's a large percent of the country, and unfortunately a very critical part of the country in our breadbasket that's being affected by a very bad drought. So closer to home in Nebraska, you can see here, I'm circling what Nebraska looked like 3 months ago as of the mid-June when that heat wave hit. But if you go back to the start of the year, only 14% of the state was in any sort of drought. Now we're basically 100% in drought, and we're at 97%, 98% in D3 or D4, and 3/4 of the state in the worst category of drought, D4. So that indeed is a pretty ominous picture. And again, this just illustrates the map on the right of September 4 of 2012. Go back to May 29 of this year before the heat wave and before the dryness really sat in, and you can see the difference in the numbers there is pretty stark. So again, why so dry? When you try to sit and give attribution to what caused the drought, I think it was set up by a couple things. One being consecutive La Nina winters. La Nina winters are reflected by cooler than normal sea surface temperatures in the Pacific. And you might wonder, well, what's that got to do with the climate in Nebraska? And I'll show a graphic on this in a little bit. But basically, if you have cooler than normal sea surface temperatures. You have less evaporation into the atmosphere. And that atmosphere is the conveyor belt of moisture that comes into the United States off of the Pacific during the winter and into the summer. And that basically was shutting off our tap a little bit at that time. That was coupled with a strong northern displacement of the jet stream, particularly this winter. We saw the jet stream displaced well north, and it continued into the summer, where you saw most of the major storm activity up along the U.S.-Canadian border. So most of the storms, moisture would come in and be shunted up to the north, and that blocked a lot of that moisture from working its way into Nebraska. High pressure in the Great Plains and Midwest really also closed the door on any moisture coming out of the Gulf of Mexico. So our taps were basically shut off. And once that happens, we say droughts start to feed on themselves. When you have heat waves, there's no moisture in the soil, there's very little transpiration by plants, and you have a very stable atmosphere that does not allow for cloud formation. It's just sitting there basically just cooking itself. And that really led to those heat waves we saw in the summer of 2012. So if we can take a look at this more graphically with some maps here, this just looks at pretty much the June through end of August period. You can see a lot of red there, percent of normal, precip anywhere from 25 to 50% of normal. And in parts of the sandhills of Nebraska and some other regions here, you can see a little darker red area. This corridor here was actually less than a quarter of their normal precipitation over the summer. So that's a pretty major departure, but it was also very common across this entire region and the southern plains and the front range of the Rockies. So as I mentioned, though, temperatures played a big role in this drought. Something that I think the drought monitor, some of the traditional climate indices don't do a good job of doing is incorporating in temperature. And so I'll show you some of the remote sensing type of tools that are helping us do a little better job of that moving forward. But so when you have the combination of very little precipitation, also accompanied by very high temperatures, in many cases 10 to 15 degrees above normal for weeks on end, that's going to cause some major impacts. That really draws the moisture out of the system very, very quickly. So this graphic shows a pretty telling tale. If you look at just the 100-degree days, you've got to go back to about 1988 in Nebraska and certainly back into the 30s before you'd see this sort of large area of 100-degree days across a large footprint of the southern plains. They're a little bit more used to it, obviously, in Texas. But these numbers, believe it or not, for Texas were actually better than this time a year ago. This map was through September 15th. These numbers here in the purples are anywhere from 50 to 75 days in this purple. And these dark shaded purple is about a month's worth to a little bit more than a month's worth of 100-degree days. So that's just 100-degree days, not 95-degree days. And for Lincoln, I think it was more 100-degree days than we saw in 1988. Perhaps Ken knows the answer to that off the top of his head, but I'm pretty sure that was the case. So that's a pretty incredible number. Last year, this time, Texas and Oklahoma, instead of 75 or 50 days, they were up at 90 days to 100 days of 100-degree heat. So the heat was really on in the southern plains last year. It sort of lingered there, and it actually spread northward up into a greater portion here of the plains and into the Midwest even, with several, almost a month's worth here in central Missouri and 15 to 20 days even over into southern Illinois. So that's a pretty impressive heat map. If we look at the window back a little farther, setting the stage for the dryness, this is a particular concern because the red areas on this map reflect the areas where snowfall plays a big role in filling up McConaughey. And the other reservoirs along the stem of the Platte, in both the northern Platte out of Colorado and Wyoming and the southern Platte out of Colorado, that feed into Nebraska, and the lack of moisture that is leading to drawdowns of groundwater and lack of recharge in the Republican River Basin, also in southwestern Nebraska. So this is of major concern as we go forward into this next winter, because we saw a significant reduction of snow, and I'll show a graphic on that in just a little bit. So if we go back to almost a year ago today now, to October 1st of 2011, this is a one-year period now with pretty substantial dryness. All the shades there of the dark orange at 50%, pretty prevalent here. into Iowa, Illinois, but certainly in this region here again, for a long duration. Now we're talking a month, or we're talking 12 months, not just a month. The longer a drought sets in like this, the more cumulative impacts you can expect to see in the hydrologic system going forward. So let's put some of those maps to numbers, because people can associate, I think, a little better with this map, even though it's averaged to a coarser scale. One of those being, when we look at, say, temperature for, again, the summer months here, they've been taking these records since 1895, and so the warmest is going to equal a 118. So for this 3-month period compared to that 3-month period all the way back to 1895, Wyoming and Colorado both hottest on record for that 3-month period. Nebraska, the 3rd hottest. And you can see a lot of dark orange on this map, so that's not a very good sign, right? Now, when you combine that with June through August precip being the driest on record since 1895 for Wyoming and Nebraska, 2nd for Iowa, 3rd for Missouri, that's a pretty significant telling tale here that this entire Corn Belt region, which has got us in the fix we're in, which has led to increases in the corn commodity in particular, and issues with ethanol and livestock and grazing in this region due to the lack of forage for feed. Now, a little bit different period, a little bit longer period. Now we're going to extend it back for basically the growing season of March through August. Look at all the red here. Look at all the 118s. Those are all the driest March through August on record for a statewide average, mind you, not just a small area, but a larger aerial representation. I mean, it's literally all 118s across the entire Corn Belt and the Front Range of the Rockies from Montana down to New Mexico, including the Southern Plains. I mean, this map is impressive. Or bad, whichever way you want to couch it, but not good. Explains a lot of why we're at when you look at temperatures. Precipitation not quite as bad, but again still pretty bad, and exacerbated a lot by those high temperatures. So here, if you go back and look at the reds here, you're still seeing this band of states right in here that are both dry and extremely hot for a pretty extended period, in fact, the entire growing season. Going back even farther, I showed the one map that showed October of last year through September of this year. Now we're looking at September of 2011 through 2012. So this is, again, almost, we're looking at basically a 1-year period, and we can see all these 117s popping up there as the warmest on record. This shows that lack of the winter in the north that we've talked about earlier and Mike touched on. And in Nebraska, maybe not 117, but 116 isn't much better. Although everyone isn't a loser. I mean, some would say they enjoyed the milder winter. So you got to keep that in mind for construction, progress on projects and roads and other things. Some do benefit from these kind of climate conditions. So I'm not really here to say who's a winner and a loser necessarily, but just showing you the numbers, this is a pretty impressive combination of temperatures and dryness. And so this looks at the precip deficits. So we're seeing Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Colorado all right up there amongst some of the driest 1-year periods when you just compare September through August, going back through the climate records. So this has an impact moving forward when you look at that longer water year period of October of last year to this. This was the streamflow forecast as of May of this year, issued by the Weather Service and USDA, looking at these basins that feed the Platte. So basically, this little basin here feeds into the Platte in the north. This basin here feeds to the south. And then Wyoming's basins feed into the North Platte as well. These were all projected at half or less, in some cases a quarter, of their usual flow heading into the summer months. It was a rapid melt out. The snow was off some of the higher elevations very early, and it was through the system very quickly. And so this was of a concern due to lack of snow. So what does that mean for something like Lake McConaughey, where we have now we've drawn that reservoir down from basically recovering from the drought of the early part of 2000s, bottoming out after the drought of 2002, was the lowest level we had seen since they had filled McConaughey, to a rapid uptick dropping off the cliff here this year. That's basically a very rapid drop-off that we just haven't seen since the drought back there in the 50s that you can see. So it stands at about 53% full. If you look over just the last year, not a lot of fluctuation early on. You can see the elevation there, but it's certainly fallen off the cliff here this summer as irrigation kicked in and we lost a lot of water to evaporation off of the water, off the canals themselves. You can see McConaughey would normally start to fall off anyway, but not this much, and that's of concern heading into next year. So we can see the volume compared to this time last year. We were at, through this time, so past irrigation season, we were sitting at about 89% of the pool, and now we're sitting at 53%. It's interesting here to look at inflows into Lake McConaughey this year, 1,700 cubic feet per second. Last year, 5,100 CFS. This year, total outflow out of McConaughey, 500 CFS, almost 5,000 CFS last year. So they were releasing water, the lake was full, things were good. As Mike said, we had that bountiful period of years where things were wet. So kind of wrapping up with some of the other water conditions before I turn it over to Kelly. It's not just McConaughey. Harlan's been drawn down. It's now at 64% of capacity, 200,000 acre feet. Last year at this time, a little over 300,000 acre feet. And all the others in the basin, when you look at Strunk, Butler, Ender, Swanson, in addition to Harlan County, all very well below where they would usually be for this time of year. So I won't be talking about how this tool's done. Kelly will, but I just wanted to show the impact reporter is showing the impact sort of in the same region where I've shown a lot of this information. This is a period since the year to date, since the beginning of January. This just shows the volume. We've been seeing anywhere from 6,000 to 14,000 articles coming in to the Drought Impact Reporter. It's been a pretty daunting summer for the staff at the center to keep up with this and just haven't been able to. And so what do we look at when we look at reports? Just to pay attention more or less to the colors there. For the United States, keep in mind this isn't just Nebraska. You know, the big pie, the big slices of the pie right now initially was fire, which Mike touched on. Then it kind of migrated over to agriculture at 24% of the impacts. And more recently, as the drought has persisted, into water supply and quality there with the blue piece of the pie. So these states, no surprise on which states popped in as the states showing and reporting the most reports of dryness, including Nebraska, which is right there about where Iowa was, so very similar numbers to Iowa. But you can see that hangover effect with drought lingering in the southern plains in states like Texas and New Mexico, Colorado. And so those areas in green, which I'll fast forward to here, you can see this is where most of the corn is grown. The three big states being Illinois, Iowa, and Nebraska. When we throw over the red outline, that's where we have drought occurring in the U.S. this year. So 85% of the corn right now, as of September 18th, was under drought. It peaked almost at 90% in drought back in late July, actually. Here we're looking at soybeans, pretty much the same picture. Most of the soybeans occurring within that drought-affected area. That peaked at about 85% in late July. And then cattle and other livestock, while not to the degree of crops, certainly still a concern with the glut of meat on the market right now due to lack of feed and those livestock being taken to market early. So this was a product Mike showed. This product is to show range and pasture conditions. I think you can see the dark browns and yellows that cover most of this region. This is the large livestock area right in here where we're seeing the impacts to what basically is their food supply, and then from natural grazing on grassland, and then when you throw in and compact the problem with the lack of corn and the price of corn, that's going to drive up feed prices even more. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not just what's happening here, but if they have to go bring in feed from somewhere else with high transportation costs, if they have to go over to North Carolina and ship it in, it's very, very expensive. So the last few slides will show a couple forecasts of where do we go from here. So this shows you what they're expecting for October in the top left. It's a lot of orange. Basically just saying there's a greater likelihood it's going to be warmer than normal for October. The bottom left looks at the next 3 months, October through December. A lot of orange in this region, including the rest of the Corn Belt. Greater tendency trending towards tending toward warmer temperatures over that October through December period. Precipitation's looking dry in most of the Corn Belt, maybe not in Nebraska so much, but certainly in the eastern part of the Corn Belt, greater chance of being below normal precip in October. And October through December, this region, equal chances. So a 1 in 3 chance of being above, below, or normal. And I mentioned we're shifting to El Nino. So this is the forecast plume, as they call it. They run several different models, and when they all seem to be showing everything above the 0 line, you get to an El Nino at about 0.5 degrees centigrade. Positive on the positive side, La Nina would be down here if it were to occur. The models tend to be in a pretty good agreement and a pretty tight spread, but they're not showing it to be very intense. So most of them are right in here between 0.5 and 1. You'd want to be at 1 or 1.5 degrees to see a strong El Nino, but that's what it's looking like. This just shows the odds of each one occurring, and you can see through here, through early part of next year, January, February, March, and even into April, a greater likelihood of the red bar, which is El Nino, and very little likelihood of La Nina until sometime maybe next summer. So right now we look to be shifting off of La Nina, which perhaps is a good thing. So this just shows you what that looks like graphically. You can see what we've been in over the last couple years is the bottom graphic, where the moisture coming off of the Pacific, which is already reduced due to cooler temperatures on the oceanic surface, are shunted up to the north. And some years this comes down, and Nebraska could be in the transition. Unfortunately, it stayed much more north. We saw the milder air work its way more northward last winter. So a little variation off of this, but certainly they saw pretty warm and dry conditions across parts of the southern U.S. During El Nino, which we're looking at now, this would be the typical pattern. Again, Nebraska's right on the edge, where you might expect to see a little bit warmer winter, but not necessarily a warm and wet winter. And a warmer winter won't help bring that moisture necessarily that we need between now and next spring, which tends to tell me we'll be more reliant on what happens next spring than what happens now, because we're into a very climatologically dry part of the year, and that will remain as such until we get more like into March or April. So just don't expect to see that change too much. Therefore, that's why you see all the red on here, calling for persistence of drought through the end of the year. That forecast period is through December 31st of 2012. Not a very pretty picture, unfortunately. So I've talked about all this. In the interest of time, I'll just skip through this because we've talked about the amount of aerial coverage in the U.S. for drought has been extreme. It had a lot of impacts on corn, soybeans, hay, livestock, pasture, and rangeland, and indeed could turn out to be one of the most costliest droughts in history, if not the most. I think the $30 billion is probably pretty conservative looking at the number of states impacted. That's just agriculture. I think that number was based just on ag, and you're going to have a lot of indirect impacts that could push this drought well above 50 or 60 billion by the time it's said and done, but we might not know that for a while before they do those studies. And it will be very critical for snowpack and water supply for the U.S., persistence of drought, because we're in sort of that dry time of year. For Nebraska, pretty much the same picture. We've got 100% of the state in drought. Don't anticipate that changing much. Our pastures and range took a big beating, especially in the warm season grasses. Those don't bounce back overnight. And McConaughey and the Republican are going to be very dependent on what happens as far as snows and precip goes over this winter. So basically with that, I'll be ready here to turn it over to Kelly, and she'll talk to you more about the Drought Impact Reporter.
Everybody hear me okay? Good microphone? Okay, thanks. So I led off with this little, my name's Kelly Smith. I'm one of the people that works on the Drought Impact Reporter. I am a former newspaper reporter, so to me this use of a lot of media stories to cull drought impacts and find out what we can learn in a bigger picture about drought from reading a lot of newspaper articles and other accounts of drought was a very interesting challenge. How do we take this narrative data and turn it into something that really tells us something meaningful about our vulnerability to drought? So, do I have my pointer on here? There it is. I'm leading off with this little graphic that kind of harkens back to the principles of sustainability. It talks about needing to look at what's economically sustainable, environmentally sustainable, and social equity as the three kind of legs of a stool that lead to sustainable development. And that's relevant. Our mission is to reduce societal vulnerability to drought. If you turn around and put that in the positive, we're building resilience to drought and kind of building a sustainable use of land, culture, economy that is not unduly impacted by drought. So one of the reasons that we track drought impacts is to see how we're doing on building resilience to drought. And I think we've learned we have quite a ways to go this year. But so what we're doing with the Drought Impact Reporter is really collecting quite a variety of data. Mark showed you some images that evaluate the effect of drought on major crops. And there is, in fact, a very well-established process for gathering information about how drought affects crops, and that feeds into the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and all sorts of economic calculations are made. But there are other important impacts of drought that are much harder to quantify, or where there's much less of a bureaucratic and a social recognition of impacts of drought. So our Drought Impact Reporter is, we're very broad-based in the way we approach collecting impacts to drought. The Impact Reporter was established in 2005 to be the nation's first comprehensive archive of drought impacts. Comprehensive was very ambitious. We're especially humbled after times like this summer when we're sort of deluged with drought impacts. But what we have done is create a structure that can collect a variety, a very full variety of drought impacts, a lot of different kinds of data. And the Impact Reporter can do a lot. I'm not going to tell you everything that it can do. Instead, I'll tell you right now what it's telling us about Nebraska. But I would welcome the opportunity, we would all welcome the opportunity to have conversations at a later time about ways that individuals or networks might want to use the Drought Impact Reporter to collect and record data about drought. One of the things I want you to notice at this point is the different categories that we use to talk about drought: agriculture, business, energy, plants and wildlife, society and public health, water supply and quality, business and industry, fire, government response, tourism and recreation. These are all ways that people talk about drought commonly in the media. These aren't really academic categories. This is just what people really talk about. We also have several ways that information can get into the Drought Impact Reporter. These are different kinds of, all information comes into the Drought Impact Reporter as a report. Then somebody makes a judgment, kind of a quality control judgment about the information, and decides whether or not to also call it an impact. A report, sometimes we have many reports associated with one impact. Almost all, well, most, 80 to 90% of the reports in the Drought Impact Reporter come from media reports. And that's some of the many tens of thousands of media articles that come into the Drought Mitigation Center each day, and the main moderator for the Drought Impact Reporter goes through those media reports and enters them. After this summer, we've also got a lot of CocoRa's reports. CocoRa's is a network of citizen scientists who make daily observations about precipitation. And a couple of years ago, we partnered with them so that they could also make observations about rainfall. About the impacts of drought along with their rainfall observations. And they've turned out to be very diligent and productive drought impact observers. Particularly this year, we've really seen CocoRa's take off. We've also seen user reports, which are reports entered by regular citizens directly into the Drought Impact Reporter. We've seen those take off quite a bit this summer, but CocoRa's has really been the star of the volunteer the volunteer reporting efforts. Am I advancing this correctly? There we go. So what this is telling us about Nebraska, I did a search for the past 6 months, from April 1st to October 1st, to look at impacts and reports in Nebraska. And for the state of Nebraska, it's telling us that we have 47 impacts reported for those 6 months. More than half of those, 30 of them, are agriculture, which is fairly typical everywhere. As I mentioned, there's a really good system set up for reporting agricultural impacts, and food is very important too. So agriculture tends to be one of the most numerically dominant impacts of drought. Then we've, a few energy impacts, some environmental, public health, water supply and quality. And then you have other sectors like tourism and recreation, where there's almost a disincentive to report impacts because, if you're a river outfitter, you don't necessarily want people to know that there's not really enough water to put the canoe in the river or something like that. Or a ski resort, it can be notoriously difficult to get good information about that. So it partly comes down to the motivation and the need for reporting on those things as to whether or not people are actually talking about them. And here same period of time, this is showing a view of the reports from Nebraska. The sources of the information shows you that 67 of the 74 reports that we've received are from media. That's almost all of them. One is from the National Weather Service. That would be something that a Drought Center staff person entered. 4 user reports, and 2 other reports entered by Drought Mitigation Center staff. That's a very high reliance on media reports. And you see from these circles, the majority of that information is originating in Lincoln and Omaha and in other populated areas. We graph reports by points and impacts by area, partly so we can see who is speaking for an area. My ideal would be to have every county have a circle in it to show that we're getting geographically distributed reporting across the state. So this is just a quick overview of some of the different reports that are impacts that are in the Drought Impact Reporter. You've heard a lot of this. It's been in the news. This is no great surprises here, but we are kind of sampling to know what people are talking about and how drought is affecting people. We had 29 agricultural impacts, 8 related to business and industry. These were fairly general that were in the Drought Impact Reporter for Nebraska. Other parts of the country, you typically see landscaping businesses and car washes are among the urban water-using businesses that are first affected by drought. And I think this year, yes, we even saw that Briggs and Stratton had laid people off or reduced production because people weren't mowing their lawns as much because their lawns weren't growing. So drought has a variety of effects on different parts of different sectors of the business community. Oh, and barge traffic. That was the other major business effect that we heard about this year, but not directly in Nebraska. Energy discussions in Nebraska tended to center around ethanol, although there were some electrical outages due to heat and drought in north central Nebraska in mid-July at one point. Elsewhere, energy impacts tend to be reduced hydropower production due to lack of water going over dams to turn turbines, and also curtailed energy production because power plants run into limits on how much warm water they can discharge into rivers and streams. Fire impacts, there's quite a bit of attention to fires in north central Nebraska at one point earlier this summer, and there are also more grass fires than usual in Red Willow and Hitchcock counties, as was reported. Plants and wildlife is what we call environmental impacts. This central one is probably the most important one here. There are a lot of fish killed due to lack of water in the lower Platte River. This is probably one of the most significant environmental impacts that we encounter. loss of habitat that can lead to loss of species and what I think ecologists call regime change, where you have an entire ecosystem die out and be replaced by whatever comes next. And that can be potentially pretty serious. Government responses, examples here of federal, state, and local responses to drought. You know, a typical local response is water restrictions. USDA has announced a lot of programs and initiatives, and there's been a state declaration of drought emergency. Society and public health, we've heard a lot this year about home foundations cracking, you know, due to soils drying out and pulling away from foundations. There was some talk about hotlines nationwide and also different state hotlines to help people deal with stress. That's something that you really don't see reported in any great quantity, although you're pretty sure that this stress is occurring in farm families and in other people who are directly affected by drought. And tourism and recreation in Lincoln, we certainly heard about the bike trails cracking, and I think they're refilling them now. I don't know if the trails are open again or not. So that's kind of a survey. I think that's it. Oh, and of course, the mandatory water restrictions that we had and that other communities in Nebraska had. Also, water utilities have a lot of water main breaks for the same reason. I think that home foundations crack, the soils dry and shift, then that affects the water main breaks also. So I just for the sake of comparison, I looked at Nebraska and several other states to see how we were doing with the volunteer submitted drought reports. And ours are really kind of few. That's because we don't have the CocoRa's network here in Nebraska. We have another effort called Any Rain that does the same precipitation tracking as CocoRa's, but it doesn't have that drought impact option. I think that there will be ways to access that in the future. Meanwhile, people in Nebraska who would like to submit information about the effects of drought can certainly submit them directly to the drought impact reporter. I'll show you how that happens in a minute. This is an example of someone who did submit a user report. This is actually the one about the low fish kills, or I'm sorry, the low river flows leading to fish kills. And this photo was also submitted. Our form lets people submit photos of drought impacts. And that's actually the Platte River bed at the channel upstream of the confluence of the Elkhorn and Platte Rivers. And the person who submitted this ended up being interviewed by CNN about the impact that she had reported. So that's at least one way in which the impacts get used, this chance to kind of get out there and speak for your point on the map. I think CNN was looking for geographic diversity, and they found someone at this particular spot on the map and gave her a call. And this is another user report. This is actually a guy who works for the Weather Service in Kansas, but he also reports across the line into Nebraska. And he gave some pretty good information about how drought was affecting crops and fires in his area. So you too can submit impacts to the Drought Impact Reporter. It's online. It's linked from the main page. There's a lot of help documentation online, and we would be happy to talk to anybody about how to submit reports or how a network of people might want to use the Drought Impact Reporter. And to end on a happy note, there is a lot of help out there. This is a collection of just a few jumping off points. Each of these sites will take you to more resources. And I've made a handout of this slide also in case anybody is interested in seeking more help. And that's it. Does anybody have any?